I apologize for making so many videos. Reading Kierkegaard is not an easy thing, and it's not a really straightforward thing. As you read the book, you'll see that the exposition of the book is not exactly going from point A to point B in the straightest line, and I think that's important not only in reading the book, but also in the way that Kierkegaard is thinking. If we imagine, again, this book is a kind of a journey of the soul, or journey of the spirit, which ultimately is a journey to come to know itself, and therefore be more of itself. And it's at the same time an awareness of God. As it's becoming clear, these things, being a self, being free, being who you really are, being aware of oneself, and being aware of one's position of being in the presence of God, are all so closely related. In a certain sense, they're all the same thing. But if we look at the section C, which begins on page 59, we come across this passage we've seen before, in which he claims that the self is freedom. So a little bit immediately after that in the paragraph, he says, in the main, however, despair must be considered under the aspect of consciousness. It is whether or not despair is conscious that qualitatively distinguishes one form of despair from another. So what's really important in terms of understanding despair and the different forms of despair, which is ostensibly what this section is about, is a degree to which the despairer is conscious of being in despair, and why he or she is in despair. And as we'll see, the more conscious one is of being in despair, the more intense and dangerous, fateful the despair becomes. He says at the end of that paragraph, thus consciousness is the decisive factor. In general, what is decisive with regard to the self is consciousness, that is to say, self-consciousness. The more consciousness, the more will. The more will, the more self. That is, being a self is becoming aware of oneself as freedom, and that process of becoming aware of being a self makes you more of a self. So, in a way, again, you can characterize this book as the journey of the self in becoming a self, becoming more of a self. Being a self and being self-conscious are not an all-or-nothing proposition. What should become clear is that being a self and becoming aware of oneself gradually deepen, that there are more intense and less intense forms of self-awareness. There's being less of a self and being more of a self, and ultimately the goal is to become fully a self, which is the self you are. So what are these different forms of despair, the forms of the sickness? They can be characterized as imbalances. Remember that Kierkegaard says in the beginning that we are a relation which relates to itself, and the relation part is the different aspects, the temporal and the eternal, freedom and necessity, the infinite and the finite. And what follows, much of what follows in section C, is looking at those different poles, those opposites in the relation, which is our humanity, I think you could say, and sort of diagnosing how those things get out of balance. That is, we need, Kierkegaard says, to be both finite and infinite. We need necessity and possibility. We need both of these things. The problem is that they are at odds with each other, and then it's very easy to get out of balance with each other. So what is the goal? He says at the bottom of page 59, the self is the conscious synthesis of infinitude and finitude, which relates to itself, whose task is to become itself. Again, refers to something very similar in the preface. And in a way, it's the whole book, the task of becoming oneself. But what does that mean? whose task is to become itself, which can only be done in the relationship to God. This should hopefully become clear in the sense that you can only become yourself in and through your relationship with God. As we look back again to that material on page 43, we are a relation which relates to itself, but through relating to itself relates to something else, and that's I think, the relationship with God. He continues, to become oneself, however, is to become something concrete. Now the concrete, that's obviously used in its not usual sense here. What does it mean to be concrete? Well, as we look at these different poles, the infinite and the finite, the necessary and the possible, Kierkegaard views either one of the poles as an abstraction. And when these abstractions, which are also opposites, are in some way balanced or combined, we get the concrete. The concrete is the real. You know, we want to be something real. And what does that mean? Well, the philosopher who I think is most influential in Kierkegaard's thinking is this German philosopher named Hegel, who came a generation before Kierkegaard, and whom Kierkegaard studied very ambivalently and as a student and traveled to Germany. My understanding of Hegel's idea of the concrete is the concrete is something real, but what does it mean for something to be real? It means that it is a balance of the general and abstract and the particular. That is, the general and the abstract is the conceptual, and in itself it's dead. The particular, without concepts, is something that is not understandable. It's when we combine the particular and the general that we get something concrete and real. And if we look at the way that Kierkegaard is thinking of this, infinitude's despair is to lack finitude. The infinite is the boundless, that which is without limits, that which gets lost in imagination and fantasy, and that's something that we can do. When we forget that we have limits, we feel like we can be anything, and in a way we can be anything, but we're never anything real because we don't acknowledge our limits. On the other hand, when the other form of it is finitude's despair lacking infinitude, on page 63, and he says to lack infinitude is despairing confinement, narrowness. That is when we go to the other pole, where we acknowledge our finitude, but we have no infinitude. We are all bounds. We are all limits. We're conformists. We just sort of accept the world as it is and ourselves as we seem to be, and don't do anything to try to change. So you can see the different forms of imbalance. The next opposite or imbalance is the relationship between possibility and necessity, and you can see how possibility links up with infinitude and necessity links up with finitude. That there is a despair in this sense of possibility lacking necessity, and that begins on page 65 and is described. And again, it's a refusal to accept limits. It's to live always in the possible, but never the actual, never make anything real. My example, usually when I'm talking to students with maybe a little bit more time, is that this is actually the experience of shopping. You know, where like people enjoy shopping, they don't necessarily enjoy what they bought, because most of the time what they bought is crap that they don't need. But it's the experience of shopping, and that sense of the possible. You know, I could be a certain person if I owned those shoes, or if I owned that book or that car. And it's a refusal to sort of be real about things. It's to get lost in the possible. Now the next section, which is the other half of that imbalances, starts on page 68. Necessity's despair is to lack possibility, and that deserves a talk on its own because it is so important.